Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The Cows, Gus T. Renegade, Justice, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of racism. Today's date, Thursday, October 2nd, 2014. So I have been told we are in live a little bit earlier than we would normally be broadcasting. Thank folks who have been listening to the program long enough know we always look forward to having black people, non-white people on the program from different parts of the planet to discuss racism as a global system enterprise. That way I think we can do some comparison contrast, get a little bit better information about how this system operates globally, what is similar, what is different, and what we can do to strategize, try to solve problems, produce justice. I think our guest for the program, I think the first time I saw him, it was last summer. It was on the BBC's Free Speech. They had a program. This was a few weeks after the murder of Lee Rigby, if folks recall. Was videotaped. It was all over the world. People were talking about it, and these crazy black Muslims who ran wild and did this act. But they were talking about the rise of Islamophobia and racism. And I thought our guest, he made a lot of great points and just being honest about how the system of racism operates globally and just speaking truthfully. Thought it would be grand to have him as a guest on the program. He is a world-renowned hip-hop artist and educator. You can visit his website to get more information about where he will be performing, what he will be doing. The address, www.akalamusic.com. That address again, Akala, A-K-A-L-A music.com. Real pleasure to have him on the program. I know we have a lot of UK listeners. They were looking forward to hearing what he had to say on the program. Joining us live, our guest, Mr. Akala. Are you with us, sir?
I am indeed. How you doing, bro?
I'm hanging in there. How are you doing, sir?
Can't complain at all. Can't complain at all.
Outstanding.
I had a great day, actually.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad you could share some of your great evening for you with us. For our listeners, this might be their first time hearing from you. Anything that you think would be helpful for listeners to know about who you are and the work that you do?
I'm a hip-hop artist. I was born just outside London, but I moved to London when I was 1. My dad is from Jamaica. My mom is from Scotland. I grew up in London, which is the heart of the empire in many ways. I went to Pan-African Saturday School as a child. So very early, race was a central part of my life story in relation to this discussion. My mom is white, and her white father sort of basically disowned her for getting with my dad. Her family, not so much, but they all lived up in Scotland. He was down here. So she kind of, the fault line of race was set very early for me. Our closest equivalent to the civil rights movement in the UK, even though there's been many struggles for African human rights here, was really in the 80s. So the decade of my birth, that was the decade that most of England went up in flames because angry black people had enough of police killing them. And so just to give people kind of some social background into the environment I grew up in, it was in that time, and I had a very politicized upbringing, going to Pan-African Saturday School, my stepdad was the stage manager of the leading kind of African Caribbean theatre, which was like our equivalent to the Apollo in a place called Hackney, which is one of the hoods over here. And so very early, I got a sense that to be a person of African descent in Europe was of some consequence. And that has informed all the artistic work I've made as a hip-hop artist. That's informed what I try to do in the theatre. And it's really informed my view of the world. There's been many icons from your side of the pond, as they like to call it, that have informed us here, but also from other parts of the African diaspora in the Caribbean and in Brazil and obviously on the continent itself, that have informed our artistic, cultural, and sometimes physical response to the system of white supremacy.
Wow, outstanding. I guess to get more background information, if folks recall, we discussed France Windance Twine, her book, A White Side of Black Britain, Interracial Intimacy and Racial Literacy. Her book is all about, even though she is a black female born here in the U.S., she went to the UK for several months to do a study on mostly white women who married or had children with black males in the UK, and how racism impacted their relationships and their efforts at raising non-white children. And she had a lot of stories that were similar to what you shared in terms of these white women, their parents disowning them, not speaking to them anymore, being very upset with them about having these children. And it really, that book, I think, really gives an interesting perspective on racism. Did you have contact at all with your white mom side of the family? Or
yeah, well, basically England, and this is where class and race and all these other things and histories work in such a weird way. And it's only now I'm a bit older and I can reflect on it. It makes me see the intricacies of it. So I'm not going to pretend there's no racism in Scotland with what I'm saying, because there is, right? But England and Scotland, my mom's family's half Scottish, half English. So my white granddad is English. My white grandmother is Scottish. Scotland generally has more, they recently tried to get independence from the UK. I don't know if that was big news in the States. And 45% of Scotland voted to leave the UK, and only 55% voted to stay in it. So that gives you a sense of how divided Scotland is as a country. So a lot of Scottish people have more dislike for the English, to be frank with you, because of the history of empire and some of the way Scotland was brought into that union. And so their relationship, because they don't have as big an African population there and Asian population, their cleavage with the English kind of is the primary cleavage in some ways. So the Scottish side of my family didn't really care less that my dad was black. In fact, in a kind of strangely, without being kind of Orientalist, in a kind of strangely sweet way, they were like, oh, somebody different in the family. But because they're from a part of Scotland where, it's a small island where there's about 500 people. Do you get what I'm saying? So people only got television like recently. So they're from a really remote part of Scotland. I went there once. And so there's xenophobia, but the idea of white superiority I don't think it took hold in the same way, because most things haven't taken hold in the same way, because it's like going to a small village somewhere. And also just because it's a bit different. So that was interesting, whereas the English side of the family had internalized all of those ideas. And my granddad, even though he didn't know any black people, decided that, black people weren't good enough to marry his daughter or be with his daughter. So my mum left the small town that I was born in, came to London, and was really around my godfather's family. And really, even though I lived in a very mixed, multicultural area, it's called Camden, 99% of the people I spent my childhood with were African Caribbean, mostly Africans from the Caribbean. And I grew up in that side of my culture, and that's been unapologetically kind of living in the system that I do, experiencing the things I experienced at school. Teachers putting me in special needs group with kids that couldn't speak English, even though I had a high grade. Some teachers openly, it was weird that it wasn't like today, right? When you talk about those interracial relationships, in the 80s, it was totally unacceptable. Today, having a black boyfriend has become like a fashion statement. So it's a really weird how it's still racism. It's just an objectifying, get with a black guy, they're supposed to be, amazingly sexual that kind of, it's gone the other way now, where it's acceptable to be with a black partner, even if black people are powerless and even if you don't participate in any kind of revolutionary racial struggle. Whereas in the 80s, it was abuse. A lot of those people got serious abuse. Chased down the street, assaulted sometimes, regularly called nigger lover and things like that. So it wasn't like today, where in London, we're 55%. I don't know if people realize 55% of London is non-white. So it's very difficult, even if you have those kind of inclinations now, to get away with that kind of stuff, because you're outnumbered. You're not going to go to Peckham, which is basically mini Ghana and mini Nigeria, and make those insults anymore. Whereas when I was younger, the balance wasn't quite so skewed in favor of African, Caribbean and Asian communities. And we fought back. So people don't really tend to mess with us unless we leave London and go to places where only white people live. But inside London, the racism is much more structural and institutional.
Many of our UK listeners, that's a point that they raise pretty frequently, that now, as you said, it's almost a fashion statement to get with a black male, and we have this mixed race or interracial relationship, and many of our UK listeners who are black, non-white, in their view, this is an impediment to being able to recognize the current systemic structural racism, white supremacy that still exists, because people say, well, we don't have this as a problem anymore. See, look at all this tolerance and look at all these interracial relationships and dual heritage people. This isn't a big problem. What is your view on that?
Well, I think that's complete nonsense, because to me, integration is when two cultures of relatively equal power choose to mix with one another. But if you look around the world, generally the groups of people that have power in this world, people of Chinese origin, let's say, a lot of our South Asian brothers and sisters, even among the South Asian community, right, we tend to homogenize them. The Bengalis and the Hindus, maybe Gujaratis, for example, the different groups of South Asian communities even have an issue mixing with one another, because they want to maintain, and not because of xenophobia necessarily, because they want to maintain their own cultural scenario. Like I got a friend, I don't want to hype him up on air, I won't say his name, but he's Gujarati, his girlfriend's Punjabi. He still hasn't told his parents, because even though they're both Indian, in his community, he knows his parents want him to be with someone who's also Gujarati. In the black community, particularly the black Caribbean community, more so than the black African community, though increasingly African communities, we have, a situation where the majority of the men particularly, or at least 50%, are dating white women. To me, even as someone of mixed heritage, we've got to examine the psychology of why that would be, that a group of people, we're not dating, let's be clear, black men in this country are not dating Asian women or Chinese women, of which there are many in London, to the same degree. Why is it the one particular group of women we seem to be going for, not myself per se, but I'm just meaning this general fashion we're talking about, is white women? What is it, when we look at Fanon and other black psychologists who've written about our internalization of self-hatred, how much does that feed into the relationships, and how much does white people's contempt, or the contempt they're taught to have for black people, also feed into an imbalance within the relationship? So I don't think just because people are having sex that means that they're committed to the defeat of racism often. And you can even love someone but still be racist, and that's what's so complicated. I've seen boys grow up together in London, because London isn't like New York, for example. We have segregation to a degree, but there's nowhere you can go in London where there's literally no white people. We had that in the 80s. And like Brixton in the 80s, you could count the white people. Whereas now it's much more mixed up in terms of where we live geographically. But in terms of our experiences, it's still the black boys in prison overwhelmingly. It's still black boys getting harassed by the police and killed by the police overwhelmingly. So to me, if the people that are having mixed race relationships are not helping the fight, then they are, by definition, accomplices of that racism, right? You've got black children or dual heritage children, who are also victims of police brutality, are also overrepresented in the police system. But you want to ignore that and claim that racism is just about, who goes to bed together. I don't buy that at all. And I think actually the black community in this country's choice to overwhelmingly date white women is a symptom of racism, not a symptom of racism being cured. Even as someone who's a product of that, I can see how those internalizations feed into these relationships. That's not me saying no black person and no white person ever in history have loved one another. But I'm just saying, when you witness a phenomenon like that is so overwhelming, there's got to be something else going on that isn't just to do with love.
Well said. Well said. I could not agree more. I kind of even want to go back to make sure I'm touching on some of the other current events. You touched earlier with, right now, you said I think the population is about 55% non-white.
Well, it's non-white British. Let me make sure I be specific before people say I'm lying, right? So there's Polish people, for example, who are not white British. So 55% of London does not see itself as white British. So probably 45% of that is brown people. The other 10% is assorted white people from Europe and elsewhere. But the point is, London is a brown city. Half the people in the city are not white.
Got it. Okay. So we go 45%.
That isn't the image that the world sees when they think of London, right?
Exactly. So if it's 45% non-white, I think that's great context for both of the points. Number one, with the rise of UKIP and saying Britain for Britons, at least in my view, that would certainly seem like it would fuel a lot of this angst that, hey, we're losing. This is supposed to be a white man, a white woman's country. London is definitely, even as you were saying earlier, this is kind of the seat of power with regards to the global structure of racism, and we're losing. And then with what's happening right now with what is called ISIS and the Ebola crisis, is that driving racism, particularly against African immigrants or even African people that have been living there, were born there? Is that impacting how they are being treated or mistreated, I should say?
Well, I'll deal with each of the points in turn. First, the mythology that Britain is a white country comes from a deliberately induced historical ignorance. There have been Africans in this country for at least 2,000 years. London was at least 15% black in the mid-1700s. There were thousands of African Americans, actually, who fought for the British side in the American War of Independence and were given their quote-unquote asylum and freedom here in the 1700s. So this idea, what racist white people in this country like to tell themselves, is that black people just started coming here in 1948 after Windrush in World War II. 2.5 million Indians, for example, and I mean Indians from India, fought for Britain in World War II. So these people have a very selective reading of history about who they think is allowed to be in this country and who they think isn't. So there's that for a start, the deliberate writing of black people out of British history so that people can believe. I'll give you one more example. In 1596, Queen Elizabeth I issued a proclamation complaining that there were already too many blackamoors in the country. So that's 1596. That gives you some context of how consistent the black presence has been. Fine, it's at an all-time high today, but those people refuse to see that context. Certainly in London, a lot of white people seem to be, there's been this rise of videos on trams and on buses of people just having outbursts at black and Asian people, even though they're outnumbered on the train. And a lot of the white people who, these things have ended up on YouTube, a lot of the white people in it cussing are cussing because they feel outnumbered and whatever else. But my thing is, if they're mad about that, they need to talk to their own leaders, because us being here is a result of your empire. We are here because you were there. If you didn't go and own Jamaica and own Ghana and own India and rob those countries to become rich, then we probably wouldn't be here today, or at least in the same numbers that we are. So if you want to be mad at someone, you need to be mad at your own elite for conquering half the world. In terms of the current drive to represent Muslims and Africans and the whole non-white world in a kind of one-dimensional, single-story, disease-ridden, violent place, well, this isn't really new. This is continuous. In this country, every year they have a thing called comic relief. Every year, where this country, has this big charitable giveaway to Africa. No examination of structural adjustment, no examination of the IMF, no examination of this country's history and relationship to Africa and exploitation of Africa. Just basically the entire country saying, Africans are not, they don't say this, but they're not very clever. We need to feed them and we need to give them aid. So this idea that black people are inherently stupid, inherently backward, incapable of feeding themselves is a central part really of European identity. Today it embarrasses Europeans to say it overtly, so they can only say it covertly through Ebola and through all these other things. But the science of eugenics, i.e. the belief in innate white superiority and that non-white people should be literally made extinct, that was built here as much as it was America or Germany or anywhere else. So to me, when I see the news reports in the media of Africa and Asia, and there's single stories, and they don't even examine those stories in any great depth, looking at the role our governments have played historically in some of the things you're talking about, that is just a continuation of the way that Africa and Asia has been viewed, and consequently the way that people of African and Asian origin have been dealt with in this country, even those of us that are born here. That said, I don't want to pretend that things are the same everywhere. So there is a certain amount of... Britain is a very sophisticated place. I can't lie about. So in terms of the way they manage the immigrant population, there is a certain amount of freedom. There is a certain amount of freedom of speech and critique. And we're not a threat to the society. We're 4% of the society, right? Overall, or 10% maybe now in black and brown people in terms of the whole country, right? And so there is a very clever, constant dialogue going on about how to manage these people. And part of the way we're managed is divorcing us. So that propaganda about Africa and Asia isn't just for white people's benefit. It's for black and brown British people, or people born in Britain, to start believing the same things about Africa and Asia that racist white people believe. And many of us sadly do. You've got young Caribbean kids who cuss Africans. You've got young kids of direct African origin who are ashamed. I work in schools all the time, predominantly black schools, where I'll ask a kid from Ghana his name, or a kid from Somalia his name, and he'll laugh before he even says his name. like his name is a joke. And so the internalization of white supremacist ideas about Africa and Asia doesn't only affect white people, it affects black and brown people too. And so part of the way we're managed in this society is to make us hate the places that we come from so that we will acquiesce to European foreign policy. And so it's not, in one sense, it's absolutely about race, and in another sense, it's absolutely not. It's about the system that you're on the receiving end of, because even people who are themselves black and brown are starting to internalize or have internalized those racist ideas about those parts of the world, sadly.
Absolutely. I see that. I think it's going to get worse as what they call the Ebola crisis continues. I definitely see exactly what you're talking about, even that internalized inferiority being just worse and worse and worse. I even have heard some black people here in the U.S. talking about we need to quarantine certain parts on the continent of Africa, and we don't want to allow too many of them to come over here. And I just seen that be exacerbated. I definitely wanted to get in as well the whole issue here in the States with regards to Ferguson and the death of Michael Brown. Was that major news in the UK as well? Was that something?
Major. But it was major news because of Twitter. It wasn't major news because the British media made it major news. It was major news because activists here made it major news, because we had a big shooting in 2011. There's been a few shootings over the last. It's nowhere. Again, there's a lot of police brutality here, but it would be insulting to our African American brothers and sisters to pretend it's the same level as it is in America. Yes, young African Caribbean brothers are murdered way more than anyone else by the police in violent circumstances, but it's still not as regular, and it's not in the same violent ways as in the States. So it's very rare that a young black boy will be shot in this country. That did happen in 2011, and that's what caused the riots. He was shot at point blank range. The police lied and said he had a gun on him. He didn't have a gun on him. All of these things came out, and that caused the riots. And so Ferguson was fresh in people's minds because of that. But a lot of the suspicious black deaths in custody here tend to be a guy dies in a cell and the police say he hung himself, but we find out actually the evidence is very fishy. But they tend to not, because guns are illegal here, and guns are people have guns in the hood here, don't get it twisted, but they're a lot harder to come by. Certainly some of the bigger kind of semi-automatic firearms that are easier to come by in the south side of Chicago or places like that in the States. So the police here, only certain wings of them have guns. But that resonance, we've always had a resonance with the African American struggle because of our shared history. Obviously, most of us here, or a lot of us here, because not most of us anymore, are from the Caribbean. If we come from Jamaica, we've all got cousins in New York or in Fort Lauderdale in Miami, because just as much Jamaicans or Trinidadians migrated to London and Birmingham as migrated to New York and Miami and other parts of the States. So there's that very literal thing that we have family. Then there's the history of Marcus Garvey and other radical West Indians and their influence in the States. So if we know our history, there's that long connection between different parts of the African diaspora. But then there's just the simple fact of being black and knowing what it is to be black in this world and seeing that relationship with the way police treat black people globally. And so that was big news here, continues to be big news here. There were protests outside the US Embassy. There were activists organizing in all kinds of different ways. Same with the Trayvon Martin thing. And the disgusting fact that both of these, psychopathic white murderers were given $500,000 of public donations. That became a big insult. And again, this is what I mean, where the systems vary in terms of, it seems to me, American white supremacy is less refined. It's more blatant. In Britain, they would never allow someone who killed a black youth to receive $500,000 of public donations, not because they're against black death per se, but because they have a different way of managing things. So we can invade other countries, we can bomb and brutalize other countries, but we're not going to have such an overt, the same way there wasn't lynching here, right? There was murders of black people here, but there wasn't public spectacle lynchings of just black people, burning people at the stake and all that kind of stuff in the 20th century. There were stabbings, and things of that nature, but I just think that the system is a bit different. And also, remember, the slaves in this country were white. The black people white Britain had slaves in the Caribbean and in Africa and in America, but in terms of the majority of the people that were children that were made to work 12 to 16 hours a day in factories in this country were poor white people. And so it creates a different dynamic. The most violent neighborhoods in this country, even though racism is the dominant ideology, the most violent neighborhoods in this country ain't where black people live. Britain would like you to believe that's the case if you watch the news, but the most violent neighborhoods in this country are white ghettos. We've got projects here where no black people live at all, where the highest rates of heroin addiction and violence are in East Glasgow and in parts of Liverpool, and that's a direct legacy of the British class system. So the way class and race are played against each other in this country are much more complicated. In the late 17 and 1800s, when Britain had slaves in the Caribbean, they were hanging, quote unquote, their own people in this country for stealing bread and milk. I mean, literally. Pardon me, sorry. So that has left a different kind of legacy where the government plays poor whites against the immigrants in a very clever, sophisticated way.
Wow. Definitely. And for folks who have been listening, Mark Duggan, we did a lot of programs, 2011, covering what happened with Mark Duggan. I think the moment that I continue to use as a sound clip on the BBC, they were going around and interviewing black people, talk about internalized inferiority. They were interviewing black people right a few days after everything happened, and they interviewed a black person, and he said, I'm ashamed to be a black guy. We've got all these black people running around, rioting and looting, making us look bad. And I just, and they they played it over and over and over. And I said, man, I've been looking at this footage for days. I've seen lots of white people. I haven't seen them interview one white person to say, man, I'm ashamed to be a white person. Got all these white people running around, looting and burning up stuff. Not one.
We've also, I mean, the 6 youngest children to ever pass high school exams in British history are all black too. But you don't see the news emphasizing the color of their skin when that happens, right? And their black father, they are passed maths of all things. At 6 years old, they passed the maths high school exam. You don't see the news saying it's because they're black and it's because of their black dad. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a 6-year-old boy from one of the worst hoods in this country, a place called Tottenham, Mark Duggan's neighborhood, right? He's 6 years old and he's studying philosophy at Oxford University. And he's a black kid, right, of Jamaican origin. No one's blaming the color of his skin on that outstanding achievement, right? But and not even saying, putting aside a moment the reaction to the very real oppression. So I find those kind of black people very sad because, like you said, when Norwegian terrorist shoots 90 people, you don't see the whole of white society coming out saying I'm ashamed to be white. But there is a lot of internalized inferiority. We've seen that here in the last week. We just had an exhibition cancelled. You might have read about this in the States, called Exhibit B, which was basically a white South African artist trying to restage the human zoos of the early 1900s. And there was a campaign, and basically we got it closed down. And again, the narrative with that, the way white society's presented it versus what our actual arguments were, have been quite interesting.
Were they trying to say that this was working against racism, and we're trying to show?
They tried to say that. Now imagine they're trying to say it's working against racism, but then the black community got pissed off about it. Rather than say, okay, we're sorry, we wanted to dialogue about racism, they called us a mob. And they said we're censoring art and all. So really, your intention was never to dialogue about white supremacy then, because the very people who've been on the receiving end of it opposed this exhibition. 25,000 people signed a petition. Hundreds of us turned up to protest it. And in the end, I wasn't in the country at the time, but they blockaded the doors and just stopped it from happening. And then we were called bullies and censoring art and all this other stuff because we didn't want, in the 21st century, when we're still living with the legacy of white supremacy and racism. I mean, we have in this country. This is something you don't have in the States, from what I understand. In terms of when we talk about blatant racism, we still have, black professional sportsmen being given monkey chants when they go on the pitch sometimes, And this happens all over Europe. It's even worse in France and Spain, where they throw banana skins at players. So, I mean, can you imagine going to an NBA game, and people start doing monkey chants when, a black player gets the ball? I mean, they'd be doing it the whole time because half the NBA is black, right? But the Premier League is 40% black players. So it's not like it's a few black people. The British Football Premier League is 35 to 40% black players, but we're still dealing with this abuse, black millionaires being abused in their workplace. And so in that context, it's wholly inappropriate to have an exhibition recreating the human zoos. And to add insult to injury, to give that commission to a white South African who spent the first 27 years of his life under apartheid, you expect us to trust this guy when he then takes this arrogant attitude towards black people that criticize him? A man that grew up in a nation where black people weren't legally human for the first 27 years of his life? Come on, man.
Wow. Just 2 quick points. Number one, with regards to the black athletes here in the States, I think at least since May here, there's been a lot of controversy about white sports owners, particularly in the NBA, making blatantly racist remarks about black people. Even the recent incident with the Atlanta Hawks, saying that Luol Deng, who was a Sudanese player, saying that he's got a little African in him.
Hey, he's from Brixton.
Oh, right on. Oh, that's right. That's right. He was on the UK Olympic team in 2012.
Yeah.
And then in terms in terms of just being blatant, I think just this week there was a major controversy. One of the Boston newspapers, they did a cartoon saying, asking President Obama if he's tried the new watermelon toothpaste. And that was just within the last 48 hours that this happened. And that's long-running narrative of racist commentary with regards to black people having some sort of special craving for watermelon. But just...
Well, you've got... Racist people are strange human beings, you know. I mean, is that even supposed to be an insult? Like, what's delicious? Who doesn't like watermelon? Like, they're so twisted that they think they can turn a liking for something that's genuinely delicious into an insult. It's like when they insult Asian people for putting spice in their food, right? The most popular food in Britain is Indian curry from South Asia. Yet they cuss Asian people for smelling of curry. I mean, they're so backwards. Their favorite food, because their food is, you know, British food is not famous for being the most flavorsome,
right,
is South Asian food. Yet somehow they've turned making delicious food into an insult. It's beyond me.
Pathology at its finest. We did our 30 minutes. I was going to ask you about President Obama. Do we have time just to kind of get that in before?
Yeah, last question if you want. Yeah.
Okay. That's something I'd love to hear people's response. Black people that are in different parts of the world, just perceptions on President Obama. How has it evolved over his 6 years in office now?
I'll be honest. I'll give you my personal perspective, and then I'll give you what I think the perspective of the society was. I'll be honest with you. I was dubious from the very beginning. I'm not just saying this now because of the way it's panned out. I was in America actually in 2008, just before the election. I was in Atlanta, and I was talking to my cousins, and I was like, look, with the greatest of respect to homeboy, and I understand the symbolic value that it represents for a lot of black Americans, and I get that, and I get why it's attractive even to the world. But to believe that one black man can change the structure of white supremacy, and to not analyze why one black man, it had to be a black man with a white mother. You know, if he looked a little more like Wesley Snipes and a less like me, I don't know if the world would have been able to get behind that image, if I'm honest. I think there's a little bit of light-skin supremacy going on in terms of what we'll allow to represent the black community. So my personal feeling was always one that was politically dubious as to what could be done, whilst I understood the symbolic value for a lot of people. And then I think, generally the feeling in Britain was one of euphoria for a lot of people. But again, in the circles I'm in the Pan-Africanist circles, we kind of were already aware of America's military intentions towards Africa with AFRICOM and other things of that nature that have panned out heavily over the last 8 years. And so there was a feeling of cynicism that the more powerful element of American society was using the horrific legacy of American white supremacy and black people's legitimate yearning to win for once against or in its own favor. And in my personal opinion, that's how it's panned out over the last 8 years. I can't speak for the whole community because I think there's difference like there is anywhere. The community is diverse. I think there's lots of people who see it as progress. I think there's lots of people who see it as damaging, as an achievement actually for the global system, because America's image was at an all-time low post-Bush, post the war in Iraq, post-Afghanistan, and by using this brown man's face, they've maybe in some ways repaired a lot of that damage, but the policies don't seem to have changed much. So I think that's a lot of the feeling on it for those of us that are politically, into what's going on politically globally.
Outstanding. Definitely appreciate that. I would encourage listeners, visit the website. I think you're supposed to be coming to the States in America.
I am, hopefully, at the end of October. Visit my Twitter, at Akala Music, because then it's even more up to date, or same with the Facebook. That's more up to date than the website. I need to actually redo the website. And yeah, hopefully I'll be in the States at the end of October in DC and in NY. So keep up to date on there, and I'll keep you informed.
Outstanding. Thoroughly enjoyed having you on the program. We'll make sure to include the Twitter so folks can keep up and hopefully catch you if you touch down near them in the States. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your Thursday evening, and we will definitely be keeping in touch with your progress, sir.
Brilliant. I will say one last thing. If people kind of want a book to give them an overview of Black British history, there's a wonderful book called Staying Power, and that will literally give you the last 2,000 years through the New Cross fire, through all the different civil rights struggles and everything. So if people want a piece of literature to go with what we spoke about, that's the book for you.
Staying Power.
Staying Power, yeah, by Peter Fry.
Outstanding. I'm looking at it right now.
There we go.
Appreciate the information, sir. We will be in touch. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Wicked. Thank you, brother.
Yes, sir. Take good care.
Bye.
Good evening. Context of White Supremacy, Staying Power. I'm going to check that out, see if I can nab that right now. I'm going to play an audio clip because this is the first time that I heard Mr. Akala. This was, like I said, about last year. It was right after Lee Rigby. If folks don't recall, that was the white soldier that was hacked to death. It was on video, went viral, big talking about. And this is one of the events that I include when I talk about the way that racists are projecting the image, really, and connecting the current concept of terrorism globally to black people. This is one incident that I include. Dr. Welsing, when she was talking about this, said the exact same thing. But this was last year in June. He was on his BBC program called Free Speech. This is the first time that I heard him, and they were talking about that incident. They were talking about UKIP and just racism, white supremacy in general. There's a female speaker because they had an audience and they were allowed to participate as well. So there's a non-white female speaker who starts off and she's just talking about she's Muslim, wearing her hijab, and how she is mistreated. And the folks previously, the white people previously, had been giving excuses and saying, well, oh, this is about economics, or trying to minimize the racism aspect. And she was saying, well, how is my hijab, how is that connected to economic problems for white people in terms of me being mistreated? And Akala comes in, he offers some great commentary. We'll play the clip, take a commercial, and then if folks have anything they want to get in before we wrap up, we'll make time for that as well. But this is from the BBC Free Speech. This is from June of 2013.
You bring your agenda actually today. Well, my question is, what we say, like, can we say what the problem about what people when they see women wearing scarf, is that something when they behave with her racism, is that something coming about economy issue? I don't think so.
Well, I have no problem with the hijab either.
Sorry, you have your agenda, you finish it. I don't know if you finish it or yeah. But I'm me from Hunter Spain. I've been here 2 years. Nobody sits with me in the bus or near than me because I'm wearing scarf. So can you explain for me how you guys, what answering for that? Well, you can answer for that. He's keeping talking that they have no racism. But
no one says I'm racist.
You have so much phobia, Islamic phobia.
You can't keep saying racist without giving me an explanation.
Listen,
please give me an
explanation.
At your rally in Newcastle, you stood next to the organiser while he was chanting,
complete lie.
Send those.
No, complete
and
lie
I can't
again.
say it home.
Complete lie again. No, it's not on YouTube. No, it's not. It's an edited version. You don't see the person on the stage saying it. It's a lie.
So who's saying it?
No one said it. You've read it. Every time someone has their arm up in the air, you say it's a Nazi salute. Please, can someone tell me what we say that is racist?
No one is saying that, by the way.
No. Can someone tell me what we say that's racist?
So what you're doing is you're generalising.
We're highlighting truths.
You're generalising.
The truth is not a lie.
A whole race
no, I'm not
of people.
generalising. No, I'm not.
Just on
I
your
mentioned certain
that's
sex.
what's
I mentioned
racist.
certain sex.
This is exactly what I said at the beginning of the programme. When we deal with racism, rather than dealing with the structural reality and all this nonsense about people are racist because they're frustrated about their life, it's totally classist. What we're saying, only working class people are racist. Do me a favour. Racism was not invented by working class people. It was invented by elite academics through pseudoscientific nonsense and perpetuated as part of political policy. From the top down, not the bottom up. In fact, if we look back at the history of this country, when there were slave catchers in the streets, people had far more allies in working class parts of London than they did from rich people who were trying to catch them and send them back to the Caribbean. So let's be honest about the history and deal with the bigger problems of structural racism, because then smaller things and smaller frustrations that are breeding this type of nonsense won't be excavated so much. But this is the problem, is we focus on nonsense like this rather than dealing with why a British soldier you've probably never heard of, a gentleman called Christopher Alder, died in 1999 in police custody. There is footage on YouTube that you can see for yourself of him on the floor with his bottom half exposed, with police officers around him making monkey noises over his dead body. You've never heard his name. Why?
Context of White Supremacy. We should be back tomorrow. Mr. Richard Williams, Black and White. The way I see it, we should be moving beyond the halfway point of the book tomorrow. Have thoroughly enjoyed the text thus far. Very much looking forward. Tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Mr. Richard Williams, Black and White. The way I see it. We should be here on Saturday as well. The compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Lots to catch up on with what has transpired this week. And then on Sunday, Dr. Niana Rasayan. He will be with us this Sunday evening, normal broadcast time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Lots to catch up on, and we have been very active very, very active for the end of summer right on through the early part of autumn. Not to be confused with being constructive, but we definitely have been punching the clock. Hopefully, it has been of constructive value for our listening audience and can give a hat tip to our listening audience in the UK. That is something that has been pretty cool, really, since we returned to the air in 2009, where we've had a pretty strong UK listening audience for the duration. If you go back, we did tons of program. Mark Duggan and the rioting, so-called rioting that happened in London in 2011. If you've been listening to the Cows for a while, that you should be very familiar with what happened there, and even how a lot of what instigated that was the brute racist officers the Saturday after Mark Duggan was shot, that peacefully non-white citizens went to the police station to get answers about the shooting, what happened, how was the investigation proceeding, and a teenage black female was shoved. And that was a big part of the instigating force that led to the days of disturbances in the UK. But you can go back and catch, I think we had Paul Ifeanyi Grant, Leo Muhammad, Esther Stanford Kosei. We had quite a few folks joining us. Dr. William Les Henry. We had quite a few people on the program from the UK. These are all black people who live in the UK and who talk about racism, were guests on the program at that time, right within the first few days. In fact, we had Olivia Butler. She wrote the book Almost British, where she was talking about workplace racism in the UK. We had her husband, Rudy Ebanks. It was Olivia Ebanks. She wrote the books, not Butler. Olivia Ebanks, and then her husband, Rudy Ebanks. He was on the program that Sunday. That was just, the time. We talk about that all the time with the program, just in terms of the timing. But we had set that program up, I think, about a month in advance that he was going to be on the program. If my memory is correct, it was August the 7th. I'm going way, way back to 2011, but I think it was August 11th of 2011 that we had him on the program, and it just so happened that that was right in the middle of the so-called rioting that was happening in London. So we were able to get a lot of live time right from ground zero reporting from black people who were a lot less confused about what was happening. I was actually make sure I get I'm just checking myself here to make sure I got the date correct. Thank you. Memory is not that bad. It was August 7th, 2011. And I remember because Planet of the Apes, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes came out on August the 5th. And I went to see that, and we were talking about that weekend, but that was also a big point for us in terms of discussing. In fact, I think we might have even had two programs that day. I think we might have had Mr. Ebanks on the program that morning, and then that evening we had Eric Green on talk about his book on Planet of the Apes and the film and the racist symbolism and all that. At any rate, go back in the archives if you're not familiar with Mark Duggan, the London riots. Very important, and that informs a lot of my understanding of what's happening even in Ferguson right now, what's transpired over the last 2 months, basically, in Ferguson, where still no one has been indicted, and I don't expect Darren Wilson to be indicted because some of it is very similar to what transpired. And in fact, if you go back in the archives and listen, the day that Michael Brown Jr. was shot and killed was almost 3 years to the day exactly with the London riots. In fact, if you listen to that compensatory call-in from the day of Mr. Brown's murder, I played a segment where they had a rally in London to honor the 3-year anniversary of Mark Duggan's death and the rioting and what's transpired since then. And no wrongdoing in that case either. Exact same thing happened. Nobody got charged. Nobody got indicted. Justified shooting. Same thing worldwide. Black life is not valued. At any rate, quick point, if anyone is listening in, if they would like to participate, I know that we're on a lot earlier than we normally would be, but if anybody has a comment that they want to get on, what they heard from Mr. Akala or anything else relevant, feel free to get your hand in if you would like to participate. We're not going to be doing the whole 3 hours. He could only be with us for 30 minutes, so we'll hang out for a little while. Folks have anything that they want to get in. But the point that he raised about the human zoo, I had reported on that. I almost had an audio clip about that last week, because that was pretty big news. It was on the BBC. I tried to check. That's one thing I would encourage. I definitely have the highest regard when we have black people on the program from different parts of the world or even in the States, and they're informed. I think people that are familiar with Afro Synergy, his channel, he's been a guest on the program before. Dr. Rasayan, who's going to be with us, Dr. Welsing, Mr. Fuller, Dr. Kamban. A lot of these folks are very informed on a global level about racism, white supremacy. You definitely want to pay attention to things that are happening in your particular area, your city, your county, your state. That's definitely important, but also taking some time to kind of step back and get the big picture. I think that was from Getting Things Done, where you're able to kind of step back or rise up and get the 50,000-foot view to kind of see what's happening from the greater perspective, where you can kind of get that bird's eye view to grasp how all of this is working, even how things that are happening on a local level, what's happening in your backyard, on your street, on your block, and how that's playing into what's happening globally. I think that's really important. But I try to check different news sources. You can go to BBC or you can go to Al Jazeera. They have a lot of different sites on the continent. There's several Talk 702, Talk Radio 702 on the continent is one of the talk radio programs I try to check out and play clips from. But just try to have a global perspective to pay attention. You'd be surprised. It'll be the exact same story, particularly if it's something that's big news like Ferguson or what they report as Ebola. You'll be surprised where it will be discussed in a different manner, depending on what part of the world where you're getting your news source from. At any rate, the BBC, they were discussing this human zoo that Akala mentioned, where they were allegedly, this was supposed to be working against racism somehow, that they were going to have this exhibit. And as he said, folks, a lot of people came out and said that they totally did not support this at all, that this is just the same racist nonsense, and we do not need any more of this to have. And I mean, literally, they have photographs of black people shackled and in chains and all these maniacal devices where they're, all locked up and what have you, and they're supposed to be on display as some sort of human exhibit. And the BBC, they had a piece. I'm going to see if I can pull it up now, but they reported on this last week, and they had, they had a black female comment on it. She was one of the participants in this exhibit, and she was saying that she didn't think anything was wrong with this, that this was fine, that they were just that they were talking about a period in history, that there was nothing racist about this, and that people got really worked up about this for no reason, and that they didn't think that this was going to be that much of a problem. I thought they did a really masterful job with that. I'm going to see if I can pull that piece up really quick here to read it. Let's see. Okay. Art show Exhibit B called off after racism protest. I think this is it. And this was on The Guardian as well, if you want to check out different sites. I said this was pretty big news from last week. Let's see. I just want to make sure I have the one where it's the actual black female. Yes. Okay. I think this is it, so I can share a little bit more detail for folks who might not have been as informed. Exhibit B, staged by the Barbican at the Vaults venue in London, was to have involved actors in chains and cages. The Barbican said it confronted the abhorrent historical attitude to race during the colonial era, but protesters said the work was offensive and racist. The Barbican issued a statement saying the 5-day run had been called off. It said the extreme nature of the protest outside the venue on Tuesday had led to a serious threat to the safety of performers, audiences, and staff. We find it profoundly troubling that such methods have been used to silence artists and performers, and that audiences have been denied the opportunity to see this important work, it said. Exhibit B raises, in a serious and responsible manner, issues about racism. It has previously been shown in 12 cities, involved 150 performers, and been seen by around 25,000 people, with the responses from participants, audiences, and critics alike being overwhelmingly positive. The statement added it was disturbed at the potential implications this silencing of artists and performers has for freedom of expression. A spokesperson for the Metropolitan Police said police were called at 1834, so I guess that would be about 6:34 if my military time is accurate, to reports of a fight at a demonstration in Leek Street, SE1. Officers attended and no arrests were made. Protest organizer Sarah Myers said there was no violence. We did shut the door and stood outside the door and drummed and chanted and blew our whistles and blew our horns, she said. There was absolutely no fighting at all. She said she was extremely pleased about the eventual cancellation. I'm actually quite sad that it took us protesting outside the opening night for them to decide to cancel it because we have been trying to negotiate with them for the last month, saying that this is offensive and we don't like it. We also tried to explain to them why it's racist. They kept saying, no, it's not. Almost 23,000 people signed Miss Myers' petition calling the show an outrageous act of complicit racism. We are deeply offended, yet not surprised that the colonialism this piece purports to expose does nothing more than reinforce how effective it was and remains as a caging instrument of white supremacists, the petition said. We charge the Barbican with exhibiting institutional racism for agreeing to stage this poison. In response, a statement from the Barbican said, we state categorically that the Barbican is not neutral on the subject of racism. We are totally opposed to it and could not present a work that supported it. Exhibit B, it went on, aims to confront the objectification of human beings and the abhorrent historical attitudes to race during the colonial era and to question how far society has moved on. It added, engaging with these subjects in a work of art is always likely to be controversial and difficult, and we understand that people may be upset by the way in which the issues are portrayed in Exhibit B. Exhibit B is intended to be a modern response to the human zoo, in which Africans were put on show for the curiosity of the 19th and early 20th century whites. Visitors walk through a room in which black actors portray both historical human exhibits as well as modern-day asylum seekers. The work was created by white South African theater maker Brett Bailey and was seen in Edinburgh in August. In her 5-star review from Edinburgh, The Guardian's theater critic Lynn Gardner described the results as both unbearable and essential, while the Edinburgh Reporter declared it hugely powerful, deeply unsettling, but vital viewing. And I will stop there. You can read this. This is at the BBC. Art show Exhibit B called off after racism protest. And this is from just last week, September 24th, if folks are interested in checking this out. But again, as he said about the refinement, I thought they did a really skillful job. They did not get the white guy, the white South African racist, suspected race soldier. They didn't get him to come out and do an interview on this piece talking about what he was trying to accomplish and negotiations that he had with black people who had a problem with this piece. They got a victim to come out and talk about how she was scared by the protests and that they were terrified. I might even play that if I have time, unless folks have anything that they want to get in. Again, if you have any comments or anything you want to share what you heard from Akala, you should get your hand up now if you have anything you want to get in, because we're not hanging out for the full 3 hours. But I got the audio of one of the black female participants who they did decide to interview to talk about how she was so terrified. And the protesters, I think Akala said that they were saying that they were so violent and this mob of people outside behaving in this uncouth manner, which is pretty much the exact same thing that they said in 2011 with the so-called London riots. They were feral rats. Folks who remember our broadcast, that was one of my favorite sound clips from that section of what was being reported. Let me see if I can find the clip of the interview really quick. If I can find it, then I'll include that as well. While I'm looking for that, I thought it was outstanding, his commentary. I appreciated the honesty. That's have the courage to tell the truth. That is important. And you can contrast that with Dr. Missy Harris, victim of racism. But as I said, you do not get VGQ, and I do not excuse folks wasting my time. We have been broadcasting feverishly for the past week or so, really the past 2 months. And I really, that burns my grits big time for people to waste my time and to not even let us know. But her unwillingness, my suspicion, to speak with us because she was uncomfortable with our stance on non-white people having sex with white people. Akala has a white mom, and you heard him be very honest about this and even self-referencing and saying, I'm taking a stance and saying that I think that this is very much a problem and very much reinforcing the system of racism, white supremacy, where you have all of these black people, and he was saying a disproportionate number of black males, where they're not pursuing Asian females or any other groups, exclusively white women, that this is reinforcing a product of racism, white supremacy. And he self-referenced more than once and saying, hey, and I say this as someone who is the product of one of these unions. I appreciate that honesty. That right there is another sound clip. I might have to make a YouTube bit with that, because I think that is hugely important. And in my opinion, it's just not brought up enough. I just don't think enough people address that aspect in terms of Area 8. And we should not be having sexual intercourse with white people as long as this power structure of white terrorism exists globally. And it's really, at the end of the day, just about if we're serious. I saw a lot of people who normally don't talk about racism be very upset over things that transpired this summer. Marlene Pinnock, the video of her being beaten in California, Michael Brown Jr., Eric Garner, Daniel Holtzclaw, suspected race soldier and suspected rapist, exclusively raping and sexually molesting black females. A lot of people being very upset over a lot of the things that have transpired over the last month, 2 months, or what have you. If we're really serious, if we're really upset about the way that black people are being treated globally, if that's really true, then we should have some fundamental analysis of what is our behavior, what would be the correct and logical behavior for black people to take under these conditions. If we're being attacked, if we say that there's war, if we say there's terrorism, racism is a big problem, what are strategic things that we should be doing? What are strategic things that we should not be doing? This is nonviolent. We just had a program yesterday about armed resistance and the significance of armed resistance. This is easy. You don't have to go get a gun. You don't have to go to the rifle range. You don't have to kill anybody. This is easy, nonviolent. I just don't have sex with white people, and encourage other non-white people to do the same until this problem has been resolved. In my opinion, if nothing else, that demonstrates we are serious about solving this problem. We are serious about recognizing that we have enemies, and we are going to adjust our behavior accordingly with the fact that we have enemies. Even if you say you're a cool white person, fine, you need to get cracking and solve this problem. We're still not having sex. Just logistics. Just logic. That's all. At any rate, I really appreciated that, and I will probably be son if I can make a sound clip of that to share with other folks, because I just really appreciate that, particularly from people who either have a white parent or whatever the case may be, where they have some intimate involvement with all of that. Let's see. Check in here, see if I have it. If I have the sound clip of the interview where they got the black female to kind of give her comments on all of this, I'll play it. If I don't have it, then oh well, you just have to go to the BBC page and you can check it out for yourself. Let's see. Looks like I might not have it. Maybe. Looks like I might not have it. Yeah, it looks like I might not have it. You'll have to go and check it out for yourself to see what she has to say. Again, I thought it was a masterful move to not get the white person to be interviewed, grilled, interrogated about this piece, the response to it, why he was doing it, the whole nine. You get a black person, you get a victim to come up and be the spokesperson, showcase them, to have them talk about how sad and terrified they were by the protests, and this is an important piece, all of that. White people are very good worldwide at pulling off that sort of nonsense. At any rate, I don't see any hands, so I assume the folks that are listening in, everybody is good. Hope they got some constructive information from Akala. Enjoyed having him on the program. This was one of the longest running programs in terms of the effort to get him on the broadcast. We had been doing emails back and forth and chatting for months. I think this even went back to last year, over a year ago, when I first heard him, because I think I did make an effort to reach out after that segment, the piece that I played, the little snippet, that was in June of 2013. And I think it took a while going through. I think he even had different agents over that time. So I was talking to different people and just going back and forth, and it just took forever. But I'm glad we were able to make it happen. And even though he was only here for 30 minutes, I thought he had constructive information for the time that he was here. Anywho, the book that he mentioned again, I just added it to my wish list on Amazon.com for folks who are interested. If you are looking for reading material, it is Staying Power, The History of Black People in Britain by Peter Fryer. Staying Power, The History of Black People in Britain, Peter Fryer. You can check it out. Put it on my wish list. If and when I obtain it, I will report back what I thought about it. Might even be encouraged to write a book review. I'm definitely going to write a book review for We Will Shoot Back, because I thought that was great scholarship and just would be important to encourage more folks to read. And I mean, I've said this consistently and will continue to say it. You should definitely, anybody, white, non-white, I wouldn't care, even if it was my mom. When they said that black people are cowards, black people haven't fought back, and that's why racism remains a problem, because we're cowards and we won't fight back and we won't go to deal with these white people. Halt. Your speaking privileges have been revoked. You are demonstrating at minimum massive levels of misinformation and lack of understanding. You should pause, go to the library, go online, and do some research. But your speaking privileges have been revoked until you get additional information, because that is simply not true, not by a long stretch. Even if we just want to talk contemporary, Omar Thornton, Nkosi Thandawe, Mark Essex, Lavelle Mixon, Maurice Clemens, these are black people who resorted to counter violence within just the last 5 years. Most of them, Mark Essex is a little bit further back, that's in the 70s, but most of these folks are in the 2000s. You can even put Colin Ferguson in there. But it's tons of illustrations of black people resorting to violence, to dealing with racism, white supremacy, counter violence, to be accurate. Counter violence. It's tons. That is simply not true to say that we have just been chumps and cowards and we haven't fought back. And we should have Dr. Charles Cobb on the program later this month. He is also mentioned in We Will Shoot Back, the book. I played the NPR interview that he did with Michelle Martin a few months back. His book, That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. It is in the exact same vein, talking about many black people who were not cowards, who were not scared, who had the courage and the black self-respect to stand up to white people, including counter violence and in some cases even killing white people to stop white terrorism. So definitely, I hope folks will get the book. I plan on writing a book review. I'll let you all know when it is available, and stay tuned. Dr. Charles Cobb should be coming down the road on the program. You should get his book as well. That This Nonviolence Stuff Will Get You Killed just came out a few weeks back. Outstanding scholarship. We need more of that to kind of push back against that nonsense. Anywho, again, hopefully constructive. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Listener supported counter racist radio. PayPal is in the top right corner. If you are not into PayPal, feel free to drop me an email. We will get you a mailing address if you would like to support the program. My email again is untiljustice@gmail.com. Just like it sounds, untiljustice@gmail.com. You can also hit me on Twitter @untiljustice. If you have questions, concerns, if you're looking for something in the archives, suggestion about a guest or what have you, or you just need to gripe, feel free, drop me a line. One of our investors also mentioned the program. I mentioned it before, but it's older, so I probably don't say it as much now, just because it's a little bit older. But Zach Casey, he said he went back and listened to that broadcast and got a lot of constructive information. He is one of the folks that I met at the 2010 White Privilege Conference. He is an admitted racist, not so folks are not thinking he's some great special white person. He is an admitted racist, but he was unique in that, in my opinion, he did reveal quite a bit of truth about racism, white supremacy, and I thought he did a excellent job, really, in a very lucid, easy-to-grasp manner in explaining the nonsense of a good white person, i.e. a white person who is not racist. I thought he did a great job. This is something we had discussed in person at the White Privilege Conference, and then he just came on the program and reiterated it for our listening audience. But one of our investors went back and listened to that broadcast recently and said he got a lot of constructive information. So I'll say it again. Zach Casey, it's April of 2010 in the archives. If you have trouble finding it, let me know and I can direct you to it. But a lot of great information, and he just broke down a lot of the pathology on the part of victims in terms of us being subject to terrorism and why it is so important for us to find a quote-unquote good white person. He did a lot in terms of just breaking down that psychology. Really good stuff in my opinion. Anywho, we'll be back tomorrow. Richard Williams, Black and White, The Way I See It, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you are having a constructive and safe Thursday. I guess it's still afternoon for the folks on the East Coast. For folks who might be listening, UK audience, hope you are having a pleasant evening. We're on a little bit earlier where some of you all might even be able to tune in and listen live. Hope you got some constructive info, and hopefully we can have some more folks from your side of the pond on the program. We will be back in a little bit more than 24 hours. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of racism. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Help us remember our ancestors. Help them guide us, inform us, and give us the courage to demonstrate black self-respect at all times, in all areas of people activity, and with each and every black person we encounter. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.